Welcome to this very special installment of Moments with Mike, as we have recently finished our time together in the book of Ecclesiastes. And my colleague and my friend, who is usually ensconced on a stool behind the camera, actually joins me today in front of it. Taylor, thanks for being here, and
Thanks for
I
having
appreciate
me.
your time. And you told me a while ago that you had read this book before, and then when you went back to it, you were in the midst of a pretty dark place yourself. And this book is seen as being very cynical and pessimistic and not very cheery,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So why is it that you felt like at that moment it was this book that really did spur you out of that dark place you were in into a better place?
Yeah, as you alluded to, the first time I read it, I found it really depressing. And then when I came back to it, already in the midst of a depression, what I found was that it gave me a lot of perspective. And so while we see how like all of these things are vanity or a chasing after wind or something that you can't grab hold of, all these things that are under the sun, S-U-N, as you mentioned, what it always comes back to is the fear of the Lord and finding joy in the little things. And so that perspective of keeping things focused on God and the way of Jesus really helped reframe things for me, and where I was getting bogged down and finding value and trying to find happiness in the things that I was doing or how successful my work life was or whatever it was, I needed to reframe, come back to the Lord and focus my attention there and find my joy and satisfaction in Him.
And it's interesting that Solomon had unrivaled wealth, enormous wealth, and unmatched wisdom. And everything he set out to do, he did it with all of his might. And yet, at the end of the book, it seems like he came back to a place of his own personal security being found in, here's the whole duty of man. Fear God, give Him reverence, give Him awe, live in wonder before Him, and obey His commandments. What one little nugget, as we went through the study this time, what one little nugget, one little thing you just mentioned? It's the little things. What was one that jumped out at you?
It's kind of it's not necessarily one that I think is easy to grab hold of, or it wouldn't normally jump out at me. But in chapter 7, verse 5, he talks about the rebuke of a wise man, and Solomon alludes to it also in Proverbs a couple times. 27:6, 9:8 come to mind, and finding like joy in that. To think of like finding joy in discipline or finding joy in told you're wrong or the way you're doing something seems counterintuitive, but like I'm always searching after knowledge, which even like
at the end of 12, right? Of the writing of books, there's no end.
But be careful in that, and I realize that for myself, that's like an easy trap to fall into. But at the same time, like finding joy in the rebuke of a wise person, someone like yourself who might have lived more or knows more about a particular subject than I do, and how I can grow and learn and become better as a result of that really jumped out.
One of the reasons I think this is a book that is very difficult to understand is it's really a rebuke, to use your word, of the two prevailing philosophies of how we gain knowledge in the Western culture. One is empiricism, the other one being rationalism. Empiricism is that which I can, if you will, see with my eyes and smell with my nose and touch with my fingers and hear with my ears. And it's the only way I really know how to make sense of a knowledge base is because I sense it.
It's that idea that like you can't manage what you can't measure,
right,
and that you have to be able to measure it for it to have any substance.
Right. And then, of course, the whole idea of rationalism is that it has to make sense. Well, it's interesting that many places in the book of Ecclesiastes we read things, and the only way it makes sense is to see it, again, from the perspective from God's perspective. Under
Yeah.
the sun is how most people live. They just live with the view that eat, drink, and to be merry, right? And
Right.
Solomon lived that, right? Eat, drink,
Sure,
and be
yeah.
merry, for tomorrow you die. And,
He
we
was
read...
no stranger to hedonism.
Right. And so he lived through that, this unrivaled wealth he had, this unequaled power, this amazing wisdom. But it led him to political compromise. It led him to idolatry. It led him to a lifestyle of sensuality that really is a dark blot on his life.
Which was warned, right? Like all the things that Israel's kings were supposed to not do,
he did them in spades.
And then
Right.
and then they bore the fruit that was told that they would bear.
Right. I think one of the things that you and I both, as married men, we both kind of took joy in the fact that one of the places where joy is found is just simply enjoying the wife of your youth. And he has much to say about marriage in another book that bears his name, Proverbs. But it's those little things. I think it's those, J.I. Packer, in an article that you and I read about Ecclesiastes, said that those were the craters of joy that he often clung on to when he was reading this book, because it is so cynical. I love what George Bernard Shaw, the English playwright, once said about cynics. He says, cynics are the people who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. I think that's sometimes where Solomon got to. He knew how much he made, but he didn't know the toll it was taking on his life.
Yeah. And I mean, we see that same trap today, and I think it goes both ways. There's the trap of, right, the love of money is the root of all evil. There's the trap of like making money an idol and seeking after it to the expense of other things. I mean, Jesus talked about money more than just about anything else.
Outside of sin.
Right. And but on the other side, I think, like for myself, the trap then becomes so afraid of making like money an idol that I make frugality an idol, and I make almost like self-sacrifice an idol, and so it can swing the other way, even that like you in such a strong effort to flee one sin, you swing all the way to another.
It's interesting too, as a man who is unmatched in his political power, he takes a few shots at the leaders of that time too, and says, you're living lives of wanton ease. You're living lives of laziness. You're not exercising the position that you ought to be doing and been given these responsibilities. I think it's fair to say that Solomon, even though he was at a point of maybe outright pessimism and cynicism and despair are the right words to use, right? Meaninglessness and purposelessness. But at the same point, he does look with, I think, an objective eye, for the most part, of how, having had everything, nothing of it satisfied.
Yeah, and I mean, he's searching, right? And throughout the text, it's a wrestling more than it is a straight teaching or a monologue about here's what you need to know, here's like learn these things, write this down. We see him like, well, what about this? No, that was meaningless. Well, what about this? No, that was meaningless. Well, there was that pocket of joy. Well, okay, I can find joy in a good meal with friends, or my work, or whatever it is that the Lord has given to me. And he keeps wrestling back and forth with all these things, trying to search out what is it all about. And that's what at the end in 12, 13, and 14 is summarized for us when we talk about the whole duty of man being the fear of the Lord. And so, yeah, it's interesting to watch him wrestle that out.
Right.
But then I think you almost have to be careful at the same time of books like this or Job, a lot of the wisdom literature. But particularly those two, there's things in there that are specifically wrestlings, right? And so, like, if you can easily take a little thing out of context and be like, see, that's inerrant truth right there. But like in Job, we have whole monologues of his friends that are specifically wrong, and that's why they're there.
Right.
And so like you just have like reading them in that context and understanding the type of literature that you're reading.
It is true that there are a couple of topics in this, one of them being life after death. I'm sure glad we have the New Testament to set us straight.
Sure.
Because if we were left just with this book, you know, you ought to make the most of every day. You ought to enjoy your labor. You ought to enjoy the fruit of your hands and so forth. You ought to enjoy the relationships you have because you know what?
That's
You're going
it.
to die,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And 1 out of 1 people die, well, except for Enoch and Elijah, right? But the fact that we have the teaching of the New Testament, I think, is a great balance to it. But don't you see also, if you and I went to our friends or even people on staff and said, hey, when we see the word Ecclesiastes or we say the word Ecclesiastes, what do you think of initially? It seems that most people would go to chapter 3. There's a time for this and a time for that.
Mm-hmm.
But tucked away in chapter 3 and verse 11 is not a verse that maybe gets the attention that it should, where Solomon writes that God has placed eternity in the hearts of man.
Yeah.
And that, too, though, becomes a point of futility for him because he's not shown that which is going to happen.
Right. But the thing that jumps out at me, I actually wrote that verse down in my prep, and the thing that jumps out at me about that verse is, let me find it on my page here, 11. Cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to end. Oh, in 12, I perceive that there's nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. And so that well, we can't possibly understand it. So what do we do with that? What do we do with our inability to understand the ways of God?
Well,
We
there's
just have to-
tension. There's balance there
Yeah.
because, again, the New Testament tells us we ought to be mindful of the signs of his coming. That there's more given to us in the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 25 and 24, and Luke 21 and Mark 13, and some of the pastoral epistles that talk about the son of destruction. And so we are given more, right, in terms of what's going to happen in the future. But I think the interesting thing there when he says he's put eternity in the hearts of man, there's something to be said about being prepared for the coming of the Lord. But there also that passage in Deuteronomy 29 that says the secret things belong to God, that there are things that we're just not going to know. And so when we can't, I'm fond of saying when we can't trace God's hand, we don't see what he's providentially doing, maybe in our lives or in human history, it's important for us to trust his heart.
Yeah. And that's what I think he's like getting at is like, even when you don't understand, like you can trust in the goodness of God and find joy and seek to do good for those around you because you might not understand even how, he talks about later about like sowing in many fields, right? Like you don't know what the Lord's going to do with it. So control what you can control, do good and act in joy and peace and see what the Lord does with it.
It's interesting. One of our competencies here at the Bridge is fearless generosity. And, in chapter 11, he says, cast your bread upon many waters and in due time it'll come back to you. Well, that whole first section is about, if you will, the blessings of living in a generous manner.
Right.
I think my favorite verse, though, in this book has always been Ecclesiastes 9, the first part of verse 10, where it says, whatever your hand finds to do it excellently, or some of the translations make it skillfully with all of your might. I do think there's a pursuit of excellence here. I think he exemplifies that. I mean, he was all in, right? If we're playing poker,
whatever it was.
We're at your house on Friday night, we're playing poker, and I got the chips, and I'm pushing them all in because I got 4 kings, and I know you're bluffing me, and maybe you're not, but
Sure.
I'm all in, right? And I think that if we could just be used by God to exemplify that in our own lives, about being all in and understanding what that means, I think that we would be so much better off. That whatever we do, Colossians comes to mind 3, do your work heartily as unto the Lord, for it's the Lord Jesus Christ whom you serve. I love that verse because it gets us back to that fear God and obey his commandments. Biggest takeaway for you. We would probably filmed, 30, 35 episodes in this chapter at least.
Oh man, something like that.
Biggest takeaway from the book for you?
The biggest takeaway kind of this time through is probably that chapter 12, verse 12, the of making many books there is no end. That like, yeah, don't endlessly pursue. Keep things in perspective. Don't endlessly pursue, which I'm prone to. Like, I need to know. I need to know. We talk about the Enneagram. Some of us on staff, and being a 5 on the Enneagram, I'm driven by knowledge, and so I always want to know. And the opportunity for growth in that for me is like, seek knowledge, yes, but keep it in perspective. You could drive yourself insane seeking knowledge constantly. Keep bringing it back to the Lord.
Again, I'm fond of using that term. There's always tension. There is study to show yourself approved, a workman under God who handles accurately the word of truth, so that he was not be ashamed. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
2:15. So there's a tension. But there is that,
right? It's not
of
not
the writing of books. There is no end, right? I mean, you and I, Lauren and Cindy probably would not allow us to go into most bookstores together because one of us would be coming out with a number of them. But while we love to read and we love to know more, probably one of the big takeaways for both of us is we need to trust what we already know. Mm-hmm. And if God chooses to reveal to us, He will. So. Anyway, it's been great fun over the last several months doing this together, and we're going to have to put our heads together to come up with the next installment of Moments with Mike, although we got a few ideas. So
sure.
On behalf of all of us who have been blessed by this, thanks for the work you do, the stellar work you do across the board in our AV tech world here at the Bridge, and thanks for being with me here today.
Absolutely.
This side of the camera.
Yeah, that's right.
All
Thank
right.
you.
God bless, Taylor.